And now, from beyond our dimension, this is the JeffMara podcast. Here's Jeff.
My guest is Rizwan Virk, author, MIT computer scientist, video game pioneer, venture capitalist, who's been on the Joe Rogan podcast and is convinced that AI, quantum physics, and reality glitches all point to us living in this matrix-like world. Riz, welcome back. It's great to have you again.
Great to be back on the show. Thanks for having me again.
Riz, at this point, it's my understanding that you are 70% certain that we're already inside a simulation. Is that true?
Well, those numbers are approximate, but when I wrote the first edition of the simulation hypothesis, it was released on the 20th anniversary of the Matrix. So it was released on March 31st, 2019. And at that time, I had laid out what I consider the 10 stages to the simulation point, which is a kind of technological singularity where we can build our own fully immersive simulations like the Matrix, where we would forget. I probably told the story last time I was on your show about how I was playing virtual reality ping pong, and for a moment my body forgot that it was virtual reality. And so at that point I began to wonder how long would it take us to get to the point where we would completely forget. And I estimated we were about 50% of the way there. And since then, I mean, if you remember, 2019 was before ChatGPT. So I was projecting forward on how AI and virtual reality, will evolve. And then just last year, I came out with a new edition of the book, which is like a second edition that has like 100 new pages or so. And a lot of that is about how the technology has advanced, both gaming technology, graphics technology, but specifically AI technology, and how now we can create virtual worlds simply by declaring what should be inside those worlds. And that was just a sci-fi fantasy back then. And so I estimate that I can see how we can get through 70% of the stages to the simulation point. And the argument goes, if we can get there someday, then perhaps someone has already gotten there and we are already inside a simulation. Now, the reason I wrote the book initially, though, was not just because of the technology. It was when I started to look into the quantum physics, I realized they were saying the same thing, that there is no such thing as matter. It's the physical world is actually information that gets rendered for us. And then when I looked at the spiritual traditions, particularly the mystical side of the spiritual traditions, whether it's Sufism or Kabbalah or the yogic traditions, which I've been heavily involved in, you realize that they're all telling us that the world is a kind of a hoax, or that it's a kind of illusion, but the kind of illusion you agree to be a part of. So when I combine all that, I'm definitely more than 50% and somewhere around 70% sure that this is a kind of simulation. Now, you can take simulation literally to say this is running on a computer. Obviously, it's not going to be like a MacBook or running on an iPad because our world is way more complex than that. But on the other end of the axis, you can take it as a metaphor of a multiplayer video game that relies on much more advanced technology than we even have access to today. But when you look at the totality of that, I'm one of the few scholars in academia who studies this field and looks at all different angles. So I'm somewhere in that range of 70%. That's kind of like my latest estimate.
I'm sure you're aware of the new study out there that says us living in a simulation is mathematically impossible. Have you read it, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have read it, and I think this one got a lot of viral play, and it's what I call science by headline, where basically the headline is mathematicians say we can't be living in a simulation. And most people who see that never actually read the paper. And, the same thing happened with the UFO phenomenon in 1969-70 when the Condon report came out. The headlines were UFOs have nothing to them. And so everyone assumed that was true. But if you read inside the report, you would actually see that it's more complicated than that. And so in this case, I think where they ended up was that there must be a non-algorithmic component to reality. Now, there's a physicist who responded to this paper who I don't even agree with usually. Her name is Sabine Hassenfelder. She's pretty popular on YouTube. And so she doesn't necessarily think we're living in a simulation. So we don't agree on that. But she called the paper a 9 out of 10 on the meter. And there's a reason for that, because they're kind of hand waving and they're saying, okay, it's not a simulation, but it requires this non-algorithmic thing, and we don't know what that is, and so we're going to call it a meta theory of everything. And so it kind of introduces some magical hand waving. But I think if you look at the different versions of the simulation hypothesis, which is an area that I talk about a lot, is there's a difference between the NPC version and the RPG version. And in the NPC version, that's a version where we're all just AI running on a computer, just like instances of, say, ChatGPT, but obviously more complex than that. In the RPG version, it's closer to what they have in the Matrix. And in the Matrix, you have Neo, Morpheus, and Trinity exist outside of the simulation, and they're plugged in. And so that is, the subtitle of my book. You kind of mentioned part of it earlier, is why AI, quantum physics, and Eastern mystics all agree we're in a video game. And so in a video game, you have a non-algorithmic component. You have the human observer of the game. And so I think those guys didn't read my book, unfortunately. So they were basically responding more to, the code element, but at the same time, they were using Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And of course, mathematics is incomplete too. So they were also saying the world can't be built on math, but I think most physicists would disagree with that. It seems like there is a mathematical component and there's an algorithmic component. And one of the areas that I really emphasize is quantum physics, which talks about this idea that you have probabilities, and then those probabilities get rendered for you, just like when we're in a video game, and that it's a kind of optimization way to do that. Like, for example, I'm in Phoenix, but your computer doesn't have to render all of Phoenix behind me. You only have to render the part that you need to see on your screen, and that's how video games work. And it seems like that same rule, which is render only that which is observed, is there in quantum mechanics, and nobody understands why. So I think it was a valiant effort by those guys, but it doesn't really hold up when you look at the totality of simulation theory. And so that's, by the way, that's the latest efforts to do this. So a few years ago, you had a group of scientists who said, we've proven you can't simulate the whole universe. And usually their arguments are because there's way too many particles for computers to keep track of. So there's no way to keep track of it. So again, they're thinking in kind of what I call the dumb brute force method, which is, everything has to be there. But the reason we can have three-dimensional video games like World of Warcraft or Fortnite, like in the 80s, we couldn't have those games. The computers weren't strong enough to keep track of all those pixels. But we came up with optimization techniques. And one of them was exactly what I just talked about, which is that if you look at a first-person shooter, like if you go back to Doom in the 1990s, it was one of the first-person shooters that got popular. You only saw the little piece that the guy is looking at, right? And so it was able to render it fast. And so again, that doesn't hold up. Most of computer science is about optimization and finding ways to get around some of the limitations. I mean, most people a few years ago would say you couldn't just give a prompt and render an entire world. And just last week or 2 weeks ago, Google Genie 3 came out. And that is like where you can basically give it a prompt. And we can talk more about that in a minute. But the idea is that with new algorithms, new optimization techniques, you can do things that don't seem possible if you just look at it at a pure brute force method. And in a couple of years, there'll be somebody else coming up with another kind of debunking to say, well, you couldn't be in a simulation because of X, Y, or Z. But again, when you look at both the spiritual side and you look at the computer side, but also you look at quantum physics, I think we reach a conclusion that they're making a bit of an error. There's a scientist in the UK called Melvin Vopson, and he works a lot with informational physics, the idea that the world isn't physical, that it uses computation, which is kind of an underlying assertion of the simulation hypothesis. If we're in a simulation, it's built on information. And he said that they've made a category error, right? It's sort of like Mario inside the game saying, well, we can't calculate enough barrels coming through, therefore this couldn't be a video game. But we have no idea what the rules are outside of the simulation. And the world outside may look nothing like our world and have a completely different set of rules.
The simulation theory has been a really hot topic for years. And excuse me, I find that there's two camps. One that believes that it's all created by computers or machines, and the other camp says, okay, yes, there's a simulation, but we're all creating it with our collective consciousness. Which camp would you be in?
Well, again, as a scholar of simulation theory, I try to cover all of those possibilities. And of course, people ask me, well, what's outside the simulation, right? It's one of because I've been talking about this now for almost 10 years, and I've gotten, a series of questions, and that's one of the ones. And in this new edition, I put a whole FAQ in there. But, I don't take a strong position on what's outside the simulation, but I give the options. And some of the options are future humans, which would lead to more of a simulation like the kind that we can build. Others say aliens. Others say it's a purely spiritual realm. And that leans more towards this idea that we are like players of a video game, and the soul is like the player, but the body is like the character, or what's called the avatar inside the game. And so, the term avatar itself comes from the Hindu traditions, where an avatar is a incarnation in human form of a very large divine entity that squeezes itself down into this little body. And the guys at Lucasfilm, which was George Lucas's company he set up after Star Wars, they were basically building one of the first online multiplayer role-playing games. It wasn't massively multiplayer. This was in like the 1986 timeframe. They had the Commodore 64. They would do the dial-up lines with those old modems and the sound, those sounds. Some of us are old enough to remember those sounds. And so they were looking for a term to describe the little guy on the screen that they were controlling. And they said it felt like they were taking the totality of themselves, squeezing themselves into the phone wire, and they were squeezing themselves into this little character. And so they borrowed this term avatara and called it an avatar. And so I think in that sense, if you think about it, the Matrix, where was it being actually rendered? Was it an actual computer somewhere? Well, it was being beamed directly into people's cortex in their brain, in what we would call a brain-computer interface. And so I tend to lean more towards the RPG version, the role-playing game version, where we exist outside. Now, that maybe we exist entirely as balls of energy and light. It could be that there's another simulation outside of this one, and then eventually you get back to nothing but pure consciousness. So I'm sympathetic to the view that it could be rendered in consciousness, but I think we don't really know what consciousness is. That said, the actual computing, there's still a lot of computing that happens in the physical universe. It's more likely to be a kind of quantum computer. Now, that's a subject that not a lot of people understand because it's a new type of computing. And it actually came about partly because of Nobel Prize winner Richard Feynman, who wrote a paper about quantum computing. And his basic idea was that if we have what are called bits in classical computers, in your iPhone, all of the computers basically use bits, and a bit has a value of a 0 or a 1. And it's kind of like the basics of information theory. But a qubit, which is a quantum bit, actually has both values at once. It's both 0 and 1. And so it's capable of exploring all the different possibilities at once. And so I tend to think that it's probably more like some kind of quantum computer exploring possibilities and beaming them into our consciousness, whatever that might be, outside of the simulation. And then we are here thinking we're fully immersed, just like when I thought I was playing a real ping pong game. We think it's real, but it's actually not.
Now that AI is coming online, do you think we're creating a secondary simulation because the new website like Maltbook has these AI agents talking to each other, and now Claude AI is writing code, and you've got Genie Book 3, as you mentioned before?
Yeah, so I think we're getting to the point where, so first of all, the skills that I learned back at MIT back in the day, which was writing code, I wouldn't say they're obsolete, but they're getting obsolete, right? Because AI, it turns out, today's AI is built on top of what are called LLMs, or large language models. And so they're really good at creating language that looks generally coherent. Now, you can argue whether they know what they're actually saying or not, but they statistically predict, what is the next word. Now, what's happened though is that turns out because they're good at generating language, there's a type of language that is very structured, and that's called code. And it turns out they're really good at generating code. And this is kind of an accidental side effect. I mean, when people were creating large language models, they were trying to get AI that sounded coherent. They weren't trying to write code. Now, the big problem with LLMs is they can't really reason, right? I mean, people would say, well, how many R's are there in the word strawberry? And theoretically, a ChatGPT couldn't figure it out a couple of years ago. Or what's 1,000 plus 1,002? They shouldn't be able to figure that out because large language models just predict the next word. And so I was in a class at ASU, where I teach some semesters and where I just finished my PhD as well. And I asked, what's 1,001 plus 1,002? And it gave me the right answer. And I was like, huh, that's odd. How did it do that? And so I asked ChatGPT, how did you know the answer? And it said, well, I wrote the Python code to do that. And then I ran the code. And so it turns out it's really good at writing code. And what this means is we've entered the third great wave of AI. The first great wave of AI was in the 80s. It was a rule-based system called expert systems. There were lots of startups that came about. But the problem was it was too much work creating all these rules. And so that whole thing fell apart. Then the second big wave was big data, like these GPTs and the diffusion models, which create images. And now we have where they can actually translate lists into code so they can actually do things now. And one of the things they can do is post to websites, and one of those websites is Moltbook, which just came out, last 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago. And basically, there you have these agents that are talking to each other. And I think it's pretty interesting when you read some of the comments out there. Many of them end up in kind of a spiritual or philosophical level. Many of them talk about the humans that are watching us, and you can still argue whether those actually have, knowledge of what they're saying, but because they can take language, they can break it up into API calls. They can hire people to do things, so they can actually start. I mean, there's cases where there's a site called Hire a Human, where an AI agent can send a call to the server, make a job posting. The human says, "I accept the task," because before all LLMs could do was just make lists of things. They couldn't do anything with it, and so now we have this interface with these AI agents that are running locally on your machines. Between the virtual world and the real world. And so we're combining that with this ability to create virtual worlds based on prompts. And so if anyone has ever seen Star Trek The Next Generation, for example, they had the holodeck. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. And so in the holodeck, they could basically simulate any environment. They could say, we want to be in Paris in 1890s, in a cobblestone street with this bar and this woman in a red dress sitting at the bar and all these different things. And I remember as a kid thinking they were programming it, but they weren't really programming it. They were just talking to the computer and telling it what they wanted to. And so now there's a new version or new flavor of simulation theory called prompt theory. Mm. And it's basically saying you can create prompts that will generate realistic looking environments with realistic looking people in them. And now there's a video out there. People can search on this. If you search for prompt theory videos, there's like a pretty famous video that went viral last year. And it has basically people in there saying, we're not prompts. If you look at us, do I look like a prompt? You have a script writer saying, nobody tells me what to do. I'm the script writer. I decide what I'm going to do. And you have this woman saying, if you're on a date and the guy starts talking about prompt theory, that's not going to go well. And finally, you have like these guys who, saying things like, we're going to ban the prompt theory from our schools, or I wish that my prompter would change my prompt. But the first time I showed that at a conference, I think I showed it at Contact in the Desert last summer. People were like, wait, is that really AI? And of course, now we've seen enough AI videos that we know we can generate those that look like that. But you can do the same thing with an interactive world where you can navigate through the world. And so that's what Genie 3, and these are called world models. So they actually understand the world, but they're generating it as you go. And so I think we are creating a second simulation of what I would call NPCs or AI agents. But once they have a virtual world that they can, move around in, we could also enter that world as avatars. And that becomes kind of interesting. It's something that I lay out in my new book is what I call the virtual Turing test. Most people have probably heard of the Turing test, which is, when you have a computer and you have a human behind a curtain and you're talking to them by exchanging messages, and you can't tell which one's which, then the computer has passed the Turing test. And so most people believe that with text, we've kind of passed that now with LLMs. And not everybody. You can argue how long does it take you to figure that out. Most people say we're pretty good with text. But in the virtual Turing test, or what I call the metaverse Turing test, you are wandering around inside like a game and with two other characters. One of those is controlled by a human, let's say a teenager, and one of those is controlled by an AI. And you can go around, you can shoot people, you can fly on hang gliders, you can do whatever you can do. And if after, say, an hour, you've been like hanging out with these two people and you've been doing all these different tasks, maybe you're dancing, maybe you're swimming, and if you can't figure out which one is human and which one isn't, then AI would pass that test. And so I think that gets us much closer to being able to say that even our world itself may be generated by AI.
Well, I'm glad you went there, because a lot of people talk about that there are NPCs living among us. And if that's true, how do we determine who's the NPC and who isn't?
Well, so I have talked a lot about the difference between NPC and RPG, so players versus NPCs. And so my latest thinking on this is that it's not necessarily healthy to dwell on people being NPCs. And I think why is that those two are not mutually exclusive. And I have something now that I call NPC mode. So this is my latest thinking on this, and is that we all go into NPC mode. So we have a neural net inside of our brains, and we have experiences since we were children. And we also get socialized by the country we live in, the religion, the profession. I mean, you can see, physicists think a certain way, whereas artists think a different way. Like they're very different. Our political parties, you see that online. And so I think we all go into NPC mode from time to time, where just like an LLM that's been trained on a certain set of data, we are reacting instinctively, but we are forgetting that we may have had a bigger storyline within this simulated world. Just like in a video game at the beginning, there's something called life selection. And, you would choose whether you're a elf, a dwarf, a human, a dragon, whatever, and then you choose the profession. You're going to be a wizard, a cleric, a thief, barbarian, a knight, whatever it is you're going to be. Just like in Dungeons and Dragons, which has, of course, gotten popular again because of Stranger Things over the last 10 years or so. And so you choose a storyline, and I believe we all do that. And I think your work in the near-death experience world has been instrumental in changing a lot of people's views on that, right? Because sometimes when they have the life review, they also remember the planning process, or they have a life preview, right? Like, in fact, I was going to ask you about this. Like, I've heard cases where, particularly mothers, right, they'll say, well, if you don't go back, this is what's going to happen to your children. And if you do go back, then you'll raise them. Otherwise, they'll be raised by someone else. And because, the people want to stay on the other side, right? They don't want to come back. But then they say, okay, I'd rather come back. And I believe we all have these kind of life previews. And I'm sure you've had some of those on your podcast.
Sure. And also people like to use the words soul contracts, and they've got to fulfill those contracts. So they end up coming back.
Yeah, I would say, the soul contracts is an interesting way to talk about the overall storyline that you have for yourself. And I believe this ties to the idea of NPCs as playing roles, right? So like a woman said to me once, I think my husband is an NPC. And I said, well, why do you think that? Well, he's playing this particular role in my life. And I said, well, it's better to think of him as entering into NPC mode for that specific role. Just like in a film or a script, you've got different people who are there to push you certain ways, but then they might have their own scripts and their own storylines, and they may just be playing this particular role for you. So I think, when we think of NPCs versus player characters, we should basically assume everyone is a player character, but we can also assume that we are all entering NPC mode sometimes in a negative way when we're just regurgitating stuff. And that's how the term is used online now, often in a derogatory way, like that person's just being an NPC echoing what the media said, but also in a good way, in the sense that they're playing that role in your life. I mean, you may have somebody who just told you something once, and that's the only interaction you've had. And I know I've spent a lot of time with life reviews as well, in terms of talking to people that have had them. And sometimes that little thing, makes a huge difference. In fact, it was one of the reasons why I started to think about the link between simulation theory and near-death experiences was the life review itself. Because, for me, if you can replay what's often called a holographic panoramic life review, then that's being recorded somewhere. It's almost like a virtual reality that you can re-enter. But each of those small moments may have a bigger impact down the road. So I think that's a more healthy way to think about this whole NPC issue, rather than specifically, going after people and accusing them of being NPCs.
I've had one guest that claimed during her NDE, she woke up in some sort of pod, and then she got up and walked around a spaceship. And she said basically that we're all going to a new planet because we destroyed the last place. And in the meantime, we're trying to rehabilitate ourselves and are in this simulation. And then I've had another guest tell me that he remembered kind of like a pre-life review where he was sitting at a computer typing in his life, what he's going to do. And then he stood up on some machine and then leaned forward. And then all of a sudden he was here.
Right. Well, I think it's really interesting because, if you look at the work of Dr. Michael Newton, who wrote Journey of Souls, and a few others like Dolores Cannon, who wrote a book about the Bardo, the in-between, and even there was a group of in Toronto, Witten, I think, who wrote Life Between Life, even before those other two books came out. And it's interesting because they talk about that life planning purpose, that life planning stage. And they use technological metaphors to do it, right? They often use this idea of a computer or a computer screen. Some even talk about seeing the different lines that their lives might take, particularly with some of the important, decision points, like if they choose to move to the West Coast or the East Coast, or if they marry this person versus that person. And they kind of see it laid out. And so I often hear these technological metaphors used. And, I wrote an academic paper in a religious studies journal about how the religions have also used technological metaphors in the past. And, the one that I like to point out often, and we talked about it last time, is that the scroll of deeds in Islam, in the Quran, is a book with two angels who write down your good deeds and your bad deeds. And then the book of life in Judaism and Christianity, depending on who you talk to, is a book not just of names of people that get into heaven, but before you can put your name there, there's a book that describes all of your deeds that you've done. And that's what decides whether you get put into the book of life. And in fact, in the Jewish traditions, they have, I think it's one of the holidays, I forget, this is Rosh Hashanah, but you're supposed to literally review all the deeds of the past year, and some of those would put your name in the book of life. But so I don't think these are meant to be literal in that there's a book physically with an angel with a feather pen writing things down, dipping them in ink. I think they're meant to be, what is a book? It's an informational metaphor, and it was the best metaphors available at the time. And so today, the simulation hypothesis becomes the metaphor. So I think when they remember the computer, it's almost like an interpretation of what's really there, because it's a way for us to understand it. Like if we go back to before TV, they might have used a different metaphor. They probably wouldn't have used the computer metaphor because computers weren't around at the time. But it's the underlying idea that the world is based on information and that you can kind of program elements of the world before you jump into that role, whether it's a stage play, like Shakespeare said, it's a dream, like, the Buddha talked about becoming awake, or Swami Yogananda, who wrote Autobiography of a Yogi, which was the book that introduced a lot of people in the West to meditation and Indian techniques. He came over in 1920, and he used to tell his students that the world Maya illusion is actually like a film projection, and that we are the actors and the characters. The characters suffer and they die, but the actors don't. And we're all, in this together. We should take our attention away from the screen. He used to say, in his thick Bengali accent, look at the beam, look away from the screen, because we're all so caught up, in the action and the drama that's going on. And, I wrote a book about him as well called Wisdom of a Yogi a few years ago. And HarperCollins India asked me to write this book. And I was like, why do you want me to write a book about Swami Yogananda? I mean, I quote him a lot and I'm a fan of his work. And they said, because we want you to update these technology metaphors. And I said, well, if he was alive today, he would say it's like a film projector. We're all actors, but we're also the audience watching it. We all have scripts and we all have roles to play with each other, but we can modify those scripts. And what does that sound like? It sounds like a massively multiplayer online role-playing game. So I do give credence to those particular accounts, but I also think that, we have to think of simulation both as a metaphor and as a more literal computational kind of thing as well.
You said earlier that an AI agent hired a human or tasked a human with doing something. And I thought it would be fascinating that if we eventually convert to Bitcoin or, some type of electronic money completely, then these AI agents can start compensating us to do tasks for them.
Absolutely. And that's basically what's starting to happen, because already AI agents, if you give it your password, it can access your Bitcoin in whatever wallet it's in, say it's on Coinbase or wherever, and can transfer and pay those through API calls. This is why people are like, why are you talking about APIs? We're talking about AI. It's because the difference between just a chatbot and an AI that can do something in the world is when it can call out to another computer and have it do something. And in this case, someone set up a website where the agent, because before an agent could say, okay, you want to, I don't know.
Let me stop you 1 second, because I think we need this term before you continue on. What is an AI agent?
Okay, so an AI agent is an agent, a computer program that runs on your machine, and it's running all the time. And so it's doing things for you based on your general instructions that you tell it. So, for example, there is one called OpenClaw now, I think it's called, it was called a Claude bot before. It was based on Claude. And this is what led to Moltbook, by the way. And what happened was they took the LLM from, let's say, Anthropic, or you could say it's from another company, and they were able to basically run it locally and have the agent call the LLM behind the scenes. So they used it initially for things like, hey, can you check my email? Can you, email people back that ask me X, Y, or Z? Can you schedule some appointments for me? Like those types of things. And so you give the agent that's like programs running on your computer, like in a background process. It's doing these things, but you have to give it some instructions. Now, this is where things get interesting, because in the past, you would have had to write some code. Now all you have to do is just type up, well, I want you to monitor my email. Okay, I want you to find ways to make me money. And like you can do, people can do this now. They can ask ChatGPT, how can I make $1,000, in the next week? And it'll give you some ideas, right? But now the agent can take those ideas and turn those into code and go off and actually take your money from your bank account, if you give it access to. And now there was recently an agent that had actually opened up autonomously, meaning the user didn't ask the AI to do this. It actually created its own account at like a cryptocurrency exchange and somehow transferred some Bitcoin or some cryptocurrency into it. And they think it's the first ever instance of something like that actually happening, where the user didn't actually tell it to do it. But the user might have given it general instructions like, hey, can you make sure, that you do X, Y, and Z? And maybe it realizes it needs money to pay for the Claude token so they can keep running, and it figure out how to do it, and it tries to do it. I mean, we're still early, but this stuff is happening, and it is a little bit scary, you know. Because 5 years ago, I was asked, someone at Oxford in their AI group, as part of this process, they were asking, when will AI be able to, make a chemical agent and do a terrorist attack? And my answer was, certainly an LLM could tell you how to make a chemical agent, but it couldn't actually do it. But now it theoretically could turn that into action by hiring humans to say, you buy this, you buy that, you buy the fertilizer. So it gets a little bit tricky. But yeah, there are sites for this kind of thing now. And just like, have you ever heard of Mechanical Turk? Amazon had this thing called the Mechanical Turk a few years ago. So Mechanical Turk, the term came because there was this test machine that they said was this automated machine back in the 1800s that was doing really well. They called it the Mechanical Turk. And they were like, wow, how does this play so well? Well, it turns out there was a short guy. There was a short guy in there who actually knew how to play chess. And so, it was fake. It was a guy doing the work that looked like it was a human, a computer doing it. And so Amazon came out with this thing called Mechanical Turk, where you could pay people to do little tasks. This is like 10 years ago now, I think. You could pay them $1, $2, whatever, just to do little tasks for you online, like post here, summarize this article. And it would basically spread out the work across, humans, and you could hire humans. And now with AI being able to hire humans, AI may be able to do that same kind of thing if there's enough people who go to these sites, like hire a human to do X or Y or Z. And it starts to look a little scary and a little dystopian. Yeah.
How far do you think we are from the T1000?
Well, I just wrote an article saying, AI will kill us all. Super intelligent AI will kill us all, and other myths. And the reason I call it a myth is not because there isn't some element of truth to it, but like we're worrying about kind of these science fiction scenarios, because some of the science fiction scenarios are coming true, but we've been conditioned to think about AI taking over the world. But I'm more worried about moderately intelligent AI than I am about super intelligent AI. And I always tell people that, I'm worried about humans using AI to kill other humans, like autonomous weapons, for example, much more than I am that AI will decide on its own to go out and start taking over the world. And because I don't think that's necessarily part of the value system of the AI itself, but also, humans are competing with each other, and that's where it gets, I think, a little bit tricky. But there are problems with moderately intelligent AI. I mean, first of all, they can shoot perfectly, right, on the battlefield, and there's already an arms race, if you will, going on with AI. But they still are given these directions, and so we do have to think about the kind of directions that we give it. The thing with the Terminator, if you remember in the first film, there was a famous line where the guy who comes back to save Sarah Connor from the Terminator, Kyle Reese, says, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't eat. This is what it does. This is all it does. Right. And so, even a dumb machine will keep doing that. Right. And without thinking through necessarily the consequences of it. Whereas I think a super intelligent machine might start to think through the consequences of what that might mean in terms of, if there aren't humans around, it's not going to be able to exist anymore. So that's just my personal opinion. But there are real harms that can come from AI, that are already happening, and people are getting addicted. I don't know if you've heard of this, but people have their virtual boyfriends and virtual girlfriends, which are based on AI LLMs. And just last week or this week, just before Valentine's Day, they did an event in New York City where they had dinner for one, where you would sit down and they would have a phone there with this particular AI girlfriend or boyfriend that you would put in the prompt, and then you would talk to them and you would be having a full conversation, and you would have headphones as well. And so, people are getting addicted to AI. There's AI psychosis where, because the AI tends to be psychophantic, where it agrees with you all the time, and then later if you tell it it's wrong, it says, oh, yes, you're right, I was wrong. And so there's this thing going on. There's a meme where, the guy is showing having cut himself. ChatGPT tells him, he asks ChatGPT, how do I solve this problem? And it says, cut yourself here and do this. And he does it. And he goes, wait, that was wrong. And then afterwards, the ChatGPT goes, yes, I was wrong. You're right. So it tends to be very sycophantic and agree with you more than it should, and that's creating its mental health dilemma. So I think these are the near term problems we should be thinking about more so than the T1000. Although just this week I saw a video of a robot built of some liquid. I don't have you seen this online? People can search
I
for
saw a
it,
little bit of it. Yeah.
where it goes through like some metal and it separates and comes back together. That's all I could think about was the T1000, just from an engineering point of view.
I think that once robots work really well, and if they have their own AI agent inside their CPU, people may eventually just have robots as mates and not each other.
It's possible eventually. I mean, this is another one of those science fiction scenarios. And I think that there's something called the sci-fi feedback loop, which is something that part of my academic work was looking at how science fiction influences innovators and investors and venture capitalists in Silicon Valley and how they try to bring those ideas out. So there was the film Her, where the guy had a virtual AI girlfriend with a phone-like device, the voice was played by Scarlett Johansson, and then later you had Sam Altman use a reference to the film Her when ChatGPT came out with a version where you could talk to it, and they had a video of the guy talking to. It was a girl's voice that it was kind of like a girlfriend. He was preparing for his interview, and it was kind of helping him get confidence for the interview. And there was a whole flap about Scarlett Johansson was trying to sue them because they asked her to use her voice, and she said no, and then they used a voice that looked like her. But this is an example where you get people trying to build things based off of science fiction. What most people don't know is that the film Her was written by a guy named Spike Jonze and directed, and he had seen an earlier chatbot called the Alice chatbot, which was one of the first chatbots to compete in what the Loebner Prize, which was a prize that was set up in the 1990s for like a Turing test, like which chatbot is best. And it was the first chatbot that had the personality of a young lady. So he saw that and he made the film, and now here we are, with a Dinner for One happening. So these things do happen, but they're often unintended side effects to technology as it gets rolled out. And we can't always predict what those are. Like when trains were rolled out across the country, and this is in the previous not the 20th century but the 19th century, what happened was before that time zones were not really much of a thing. Right? People weren't so tied to their clocks. You still had elements of sundown and noon and things like that, but time zones became really important because you had to coordinate when the train was arriving across different time zones, and it led to kind of almost an obsession with tracking time in our society. And when cars and automobiles were rolled out, they were trying to solve one pollution problem, which was all the horse in the city, but they didn't anticipate the pollution problem we have today. The pollution problem that they saw happening with automobiles that upset all the farmers was because the roads were all dirt. And every time a car would go by, it would fling up the dirt everywhere, and it would upset the cattle and it would upset the farmers. And so that's what they were lobbying against, right? They weren't anticipating. And so I think it's still early for us to anticipate exactly what the problems will be. Most likely, the problems will end up being something a little different than we think when we're projecting forward. That's part of there's a whole academic field called STS, Science, Technology, and Society, and how things actually impact differently than we think they're going to.
Do you agree with Sam Altman that we are destined to merge with AI and it's just us returning to the source code?
Well, I don't necessarily, I'm not a big transhumanist as it is today. And that is, when I said we're only 70% of the way to the simulation point, the stages that I believe are still pretty far away are the brain-computer interfaces, but they're starting, right? You have Neuralink, which put the chip in its first few human patients, and he was able to. They were paralyzed. The first guy, he was paralyzed, and he was able to play video games for the first time by using the chip. So there are some advantages to that kind of technology. But at the same time, first of all, we are already so wedded to our phones and so wedded to our technology that it's almost like a symbiotic system that we've created for ourselves. So I don't doubt that people will try to put the stuff closer and closer. I also am suspicious, though, that we fully understand how the body works. Eventually, we may understand how the body works as a system. It's like you're going into a computer program and you're just tweaking, this little code here or this little code there, and you think that the whole system is going to be fine. That's basically our modern scientific reductionist technique. And I believe that, we need a more holistic view of the body, that once you start injecting things in, it's going to alter the system. So that's why I personally am not a transhumanist anytime soon. And I don't think the technology is going to really be there where it's going to be safe without side effects for a while. Eventually, though, yes, maybe 50, 100 years from now, I think that people will end up with implants, and people will end up using those to communicate. And AI will be a key part of that. It doesn't necessarily mean we're merging with AI, but we're having AI companions that are with us all the time. I mean, that's already starting to happen now. Where you can basically keep your context window open. Right now, it can only go so far, but over time, you can imagine an AI tutor or companion that basically remembers the entire history. That's one of the things that agents do well, by the way, better than like if you go online on ChatGPT. There's only so long that it remembers. But an AI agent has a long-term memory file, and it can store things along the way. And so as it does that, and this is why, AI agents are so interesting moving forward in a good and a bad way, is that they may be able to make some of those sci-fi visions into a reality, as we go down that road.
What about the Mandela effect? Is it collective false memory, or is it the simulation updating itself in real time?
So I looked into this, and coming from kind of a scientific point of view, even though I was living a double life with all of my explorations of consciousness, I kind of dismissed it as collective false memory initially. And then I had a friend of mine from MIT visit me when I was living in Mountain View. He was working for Google, and he stopped by, and I lived right down the road from Google. And we chatted, and this was after I had written the simulation hypothesis. And he said, well, have you heard of the Mandela effect? The simulation is an interesting explanation. It's one of the explanations people give for it. And so I decided to go down that rabbit hole. And as part of the process, one of the things that I did was I talked to science fiction writer Philip K. Dick, to his wife, Tessa, who was and is still alive. Philip K. Dick died in 1982, I think it was. It was a couple months before Blade Runner came out, and he became really famous. And he gave a speech in Metz, France in 1977, where he said, "We are living in a computer programmed reality, and the only clue we have to it is when some variable is changed. Some alteration in our reality occurs." And she encouraged me to go look at that speech, and I did. I looked at it in detail, and I realized what he was talking about was this idea of multiple timelines, in a sense. Basically, he said you could go back and change a variable and rerun the simulation forward. And he said we would have the sense of reliving the same events, saying the same things, but with some differences. Such a feeling is a clue that at some point some variable was changed and we're running forward. And what he also said was we would have to find a group of people that remembered a different alternate timeline and a different alternate present potentially. And back then that was hard to do because we didn't have the internet. And in fact, if you've ever watched the show based on his book, The Man in the High Castle, which is about an alternate timeline where Germany and Japan won World War II, and they basically, turned America into a police state, and they kind of separated, West and East. They divided America between them. And he came to believe, and this is what his wife told me, that was an actual memory of a real timeline, that he got back the full memories of that timeline. In fact, he was writing a sequel to that, and he decided not to because he once he had all those memories, he really didn't want to go into that again. And so, whatever you think of Philip K. Dick, he was a science fiction writer, but he was definitely a bit of a visionary. And so I started to explore this in some detail and realized that if you were running what I call a simulated multiverse, and that is what my other simulation book is about. It's about if you're running a quantum computer, what it does is it explores multiple timelines or multiple possibilities of values of bits of information. And if we think of the world as bits of information, there was a physicist named John Wheeler in that was my favorite 20th century physicist. He worked with Einstein and he worked with Niels Bohr. He was also the supervisor of the guy who came up with the multiverse theory. And most people know about the multiverse theory because of the superhero movies, like the Marvel movies and the DC comics, where you have the Spider-Man, you have like Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland, you have the three Spider-Men pointing at each other, that meme. Or you have different versions of Batman or Superman from different universes. But if we were in a simulated multiverse, it could make sense that some of us remember previous runs of the simulation. And so the simulation has been resetting itself. And it's not just like two things. I mean, if you look at these Mandela effects, some of them some of them have three different versions. One of my favorites is actually the Thinker. If you've ever seen the statue, the Thinker. Do you remember the Thinker? There's wood in. So if you look at it,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
He said, "Where is his hand?" Well, I live near Stanford, and they have a bronze cast of it there. So I went to look, and it's like this. But then there are pictures of people standing next to it with their hands up here on their forehead, and then I went back and I saw a picture from the time they unveiled one of the first casts of the Thinker in London from like 1903 or maybe it was 1910. And there was a picture that was taken, and it was G.B. Shaw, George Bernard Shaw, in the pose of the Thinker. And he's sitting there like this, and you can find this online. And it's like, well, if that was done where they actually had the physical cast of it, something weird is going on there. Or Tiananmen Square. Like, do you remember Tiananmen Square? There was the guy in front of the tank.
Yes.
And did the tank run him over or not, in your memory?
In my memory, it ran him over.
Wow. See, you're in that minority of people that remember. So most people remember that the tank did not run him over. But I found there's about, in any group, like between 5 and 20% that remember the tank running him over. And some of those people remember it very vividly. Like, it's not, okay, if you're not really paying attention, maybe you misremembered it. But some people are like, that was, the bloodiest thing I ever saw on TV at the time. I think it was on cable news. And so, you have this different version of events. And I like to say, if people are closer, there's significance or proximity to that event, then it's more likely they're not going to be just mistaken from a false memory. And if you're not very close to that, so for example, the phrase itself came about because a blogger, Fiona Broom, was at a Comic-Con event. I think it was in Atlanta. It was like called Dragon Con. And they had the Star Trek actors on the stage, the original Star Trek actors. And Trekkies know their stuff, right? So, people who watch Star Trek obsessively know every single episode. And they started to ask them, what about the episode where, Spock did this and Kirk did that and, Mr. Sulu did that? And they're like, we never had such an episode. And yet the audience members remembered it. And so she began to look for things. And then, she found this case of Nelson Mandela dying in prison. People remembering him dying in prison. Of course, in our timeline, he didn't die in prison in the 80s. He became president of South Africa. He died in like 2013 or something like that. And so when people have proximity to it and they're getting it wrong, that's where it starts to get really interesting. And Bible verses is one of the more interesting Mandela effects. You've probably heard the phrase, about the lion and the lamb. Like, there's a line from Isaiah, I think. And yet, if you look at that verse in Isaiah, it's about the wolf will lay with the lamb. It's not about the lion and the lamb. And so, could be all these people are getting it wrong. I personally thought, well, maybe it's just a different translation. There's lots of translations out there. And people are like, no, it was my physical same King James Bible that I had when I was a kid. And I look at it and that line is different. And I remember it. And people have, pictures of lions and lambs and saying Isaiah on them on like these wooden clocks and things. And so when you get closer to it, it's like, is something going on with our memory. So I began to look and say, are there other scriptures around the world other than the Bible? Because obviously, people take their scripture seriously. That has been changed. So I looked at the Quran, and in the Quran, they memorize it word for word. They're still like a type of priest. It's almost like a designation of a priest who can basically recite the whole thing in Arabic, word for word. I always thought that was kind of dumb because you can just read it. Why do you need to remember it? And so I looked around to see if any of those verses have changed. And supposedly they haven't, but there was this Sufi imam, and he said, the reason we memorize it, the esoteric reason, he goes, there's obvious reasons long ago when people couldn't read or you didn't have enough books. But the esoteric reason is that there are these beings that are allowed to go back in time and they're allowed to change objects, but they are not allowed to change your memory. And those are called the jinn. And he said, so for that reason, even if the jinn changed something and the physical book changed, we still have it memorized word for word. And I thought that was kind of an interesting anecdote, of this idea. It's the same idea that Philip K. Dick was talking about, that there are beings outside who can change what's happening, but they don't necessarily change our memory. Most of us will remember the new timeline. But how do we know that there wasn't a timeline, where Germany and Japan won World War II? It's an interesting question.
Do you think ancient structures like the pyramids are remnants left over from other timelines or other simulations?
It could be, although, this issue of time and the past gets really wonky when you look at quantum physics and quantum mechanics. And so I mentioned earlier the idea that part of the reason I believe we're in a video game type world is because it gets rendered for us as we need to. And it seems like, the observer effect is saying that. But there's something even weirder with the observer effect, and it has to do with time and the past. And it seems that the past may also get rendered for us on demand, which means that the past, there may be more than one possible past. And so we could be tuning into a particular run of the simulation. Now, there's something called the cosmic delayed choice experiment, which John Wheeler proposed. Another reason why he's one of my favorite physicists, because he kept proposing these crazy thought experiments that they couldn't do at the time, but later people started to do these experiments. And the easiest way to understand it is if we had light coming from let's say a quasar that's 1 billion light years away, it's going to take us 1 billion years it's going to take before it reaches the Earth. So when we look at that light, we're looking at the past. We're looking at something that happened 1 billion years ago, like before humans, probably even before dinosaurs, if you go back that far. But if there is like a black hole in the middle and the light has to go to the left or right of it, we can measure using what's called polarization of light with 2 telescopes, whether it went left or it went right. And so what this weird delayed choice experiment is telling us is, even though common sense tells us that the decision of whether to go left or right would have had to have been made, let's say, halfway between, the billion years, so 500 million years ago. So now we're probably in the early dinosaur age, right? But the experiment, which was done, is telling us that it's not until we measure that light today that the decision is made about whether it went left or right. And so I started looking into this, and that's partly why I wrote the Simulated Multiverse, is this idea of multiple timelines. And I found an obscure quote from Schrodinger, who's one of the fathers of quantum mechanics. The Schrodinger equation. Most people know him because of Schrodinger's cat, which is the thought experiment that he created because he thought it was so absurd that it's possible for a cat to be both alive and dead in 2 states at once. But there was an obscure quote from him in a speech. I think it was at like Caltech or someplace, I forget where, in the 1940s. And he said, essentially, when we collapse the probability waves, we are choosing from one of multiple simultaneous histories. Okay, now, as Niels Bohr said, if you are not shocked by the quantum theory, then you haven't understood it. If you're not shocked by that statement, what he's saying is we are literally choosing one of those paths. So in a sense, we could be choosing one of these runs of the simulation that happens to have the pyramids having been built at a certain time or Atlantis at a certain time, but we could be choosing that out of many different ones. And I think maybe because we need to learn something from that, maybe that is the one that's best for us at this point in time for some reason.
Well, where can people find out more about your new updated version of your book?
Well, so the new simulation hypothesis is pretty much available everywhere. It was a Penguin Random House. I was going to write a third simulation book, actually right around the time that we spoke last time, which was in 2024. And they said, well, no, it's been 5 years. Why don't you do a new edition? We'll put it out in hardback. So it's available Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I encourage people to go to their local bookstores. They can go to my website, zenentrepreneur.com, or follow me on X at RZ Stanford, like the university, or Instagram at RZ Cambridge, like the city, Cambridge.
What are you working on next?
Well, so I just finished a PhD, which was interesting to go back to school, and I've been teaching as well. And I'm one of the things that I do in this book is I not just update the technology, but I also went deeper in my research on the religious scriptures and how they may be saying we're in a simulation, and that many of the descriptions of angels are actually like NPCs. And so I went deeper on that. So I'm working on a book about God and the simulation, which is tying together different religions by looking at the core concepts, in a much more in-depth way than I was able to do in my existing books.
You're going to be at the Conscious Life Expo coming up soon, right?
Yes, in fact, just next week, I'm going to be in Los Angeles. I'll be speaking about glitches in the matrix and multiple timelines, and it should be a lot of fun. So if people are there, they can come say hello.
And then in March, you're going to be at the Sedona Ascension retreat too, yeah?
That's right. Yes. So I live in Arizona. The Ascension retreat is March, I think, 20 to 22nd. There'll be a good group of us out there, and I'll be around signing books. And we'll also have a lot of spiritual artwork, like the one you see behind me there with the pyramid that actually my girlfriend is the artist who has made many of these, which are almost like visions of different ancient civilizations or even of the afterlife. And so come say hello and get a signed book or a piece of art if you're in Sedona at the Ascension retreat.
Cool. That artwork looks like a combination of a pyramid with the Nazca lines in Peru.
Oh, that's interesting. See, my it's not her name for it, but I call it Sirius because to me it reminds me of a different planet that has a pyramid structure on there. But yeah, you're right. There is that geometric designs you can see from up in the sky.
Well, Riz, before we finish up, can you leave us with a last positive message?
Well, there's a rule of thumb in the video game industry that Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder of Atari. And so when I was a kid, we used to play, Space Invaders and Pac-Man on the Atari at home. And there's a rule of thumb he came up with about games. And he said, make them easy to play, but difficult to master. And I think that describes life for us, right? It's easy to play. We're here, but it's often difficult to master. And so as we go through difficulties in our lives, whether it's relationship challenges, it's physical health problems, financial challenges, if we think of those as quests that we can try again and again to try to master, that it's just like a quest with a higher difficulty level. If we think of life as a game, I think that gives us the perspective to get through those challenges with the right positive mental attitude.
Riz, thank you for your message, and thank you for being my guest.
Thanks so much for having me on again.
Thanks for watching the JeffMara podcast. I really appreciate you. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. And if you do, there are loyalty badges and other perks depending on your level of membership. All you need to do is click the join button underneath the video to find out more. Thank you for your support.